The shriek of the train's whistle cut through the summer heat, a sound that meant connection to a world far from Redemption, Arizona territory. Caleb Wolf stood on the splintered platform, his hands loose at his sides, watching the steam billow and the iron engine grind to a halt. He was a man who had built a reputation on the speed of his hands, but now all he wanted was the slow certainty of a life planted in the ground. The arrangement had been made through letters that took weeks to travel, a dry transaction of necessity. He needed a wife to help work his homestead claim, and a family in San Francisco needed to unburden themselves of a daughter. The townsfolk who had gathered to watch the train's arrival eyed him with a mixture of fear and curiosity. They knew of Caleb Wolf. They knew he had been a man who settled disputes for the railroad, a man whose quietness was more dangerous than another man's shouting. But this was different. This was a vulnerability they could all understand, and they watched, hungry for a weakness to appear in his calm facade. When she stepped down from the passenger car, a hush fell over the platform. The woman was small, swallowed by a dress of dark green silk that seemed to absorb the harsh sunlight rather than reflect it. Her hair was a knot of polished black, and her face was still, her eyes fixed not on Caleb, but on the dusty street beyond the station. The whispers started immediately, a low hiss of snakes in the grass. "That's her?" a woman muttered from behind her fan. "She's plain." Another man snickered to his friend. "Wolf bought himself the ugly Chinese daughter." The words were meant to sting, to humiliate. Caleb heard them all, but his attention was fixed on the woman. The town saw a foreign curiosity, a disappointing mail-order bride. Caleb saw the straightness of her spine. He saw the way her hands were clasped before her, not in fear, but in a kind of resolute stillness. He saw that her eyes, though scanning the unfamiliar landscape, held no panic. They were the eyes of someone who had already made their calculations and accepted the sum. He moved then, his boots sounding loud on the warped wood. He ignored the gawking crowd and stopped a few feet from her. She finally turned her gaze on him, and for a moment they just looked at each other. He was taller than the letters had suggested, his face weathered by a sun she had never known, his eyes a pale, clear gray. "You are Lynn," he said. It was not a question. She gave a single, sharp nod. "You are Mr. Wolf." Her English was precise, carrying an accent that was not of the frontier, but of a classroom. "Caleb," he corrected gently. He reached for the single, small trunk at her feet. It was surprisingly heavy. "Welcome to Redemption." As he turned to lead her away, the whispers rose again, this time laced with mockery for his decision to go through with it. He didn't look back. He had faced down men with guns drawn and felt less pressure than he did walking through that small crowd with this stranger beside him. But as they stepped into the full, brutal glare of the Arizona sun, he glanced at her. Her face was a mask of composure. She did not shrink from the stares. She simply walked, her steps measured and deliberate, as if she were walking through a garden and not a gauntlet of prejudice. In that moment, Caleb suspected the letters had told him nothing of importance about the woman who was to be his wife. The walk to the general store was a silent parade. Children pointed. Women pulled their skirts aside as if Lynn's green silk might carry a contagion. The men on the porch of the saloon stopped their card game to stare openly. Lynn kept her eyes forward, her pace unwavering. It was Caleb who felt the slow burn of anger rising in his chest. He had left a world of violence behind, but he was beginning to realize that cruelty had other weapons besides a pistol. Bartholomew Thorne blocked their path. He was a man whose wealth had been built on buying land and squeezing the water rights until his neighbors were forced to sell for pennies on the dollar. He was large and impeccably dressed, a stark contrast to the dust-caked citizens of Redemption. He smiled, a slow, predatory expression that never reached his eyes. "Well, Wolf," Thorne said, his voice loud enough for the whole street to hear. "I see your cargo has arrived. I trust the railroad delivered her in good condition?" He looked Lynn up and down with an appraiser's insolent gaze. Caleb stopped. He didn't shift his stance or reach for the Colt peacemaker that hung on his hip, a relic of his former life he couldn't bring himself to discard. He simply went still, and that stillness was more potent than any threat. "She's not cargo, Thorne. She's my wife." Thorne laughed, a booming sound that invited others to join in. A few did, nervously. "Your wife? A man like you settling for that? I'd have thought you had higher standards. Or perhaps your pockets are lighter than they used to be." He gestured vaguely toward Lynn. "Still, I'm a reasonable man. I'll give you $50 for her. My railroad crews are always in need of a laundress." The insult hung in the hot, dry air. Lynn's expression did not change, but Caleb saw her hands tighten into small fists at her side. He took a half step, placing himself slightly in front of her. "You'll move, Thorne," Caleb said, his voice low and flat, "or I'll move you." For a long moment, the two men stood locked in a battle of wills. Thorne's bravado was built on money and influence. Caleb's authority came from a different place, a place of cold, hard consequence that Thorne could see in the depths of his gray eyes. The landowner's smile faltered. He knew Caleb's reputation was not an exaggeration. Just then, a pair of horses tethered to a freight wagon spooked, startled by a dog darting into the street. They reared, eyes wide with panic, threatening to bolt and overturn the wagon laden with barrels. The freighter yelled, fumbling with the reins. People scattered. Before Caleb could even react, Lynn moved. She slipped past him with a swift, fluid grace that was startling. She didn't approach the horses from the front. Instead, she circled to the side, speaking in a low, calm voice. It wasn't English or Chinese. It was a sound, a soothing, rhythmic murmur that cut through the animal's fear. She reached out, not for the reins, but for the cheek of the nearest horse, her touch light and confident. The horse stopped pulling, its ears twitching toward the sound of her voice. It quieted, and its partner followed suit, their trembling subsiding under the spell of her serene confidence. The entire street had stopped to watch. The freighter, his face pale with shock, stammered his thanks. Lynn simply nodded, gave the horse one last gentle stroke, and stepped back to Caleb's side as if she had done nothing more than brush a piece of lint from her sleeve. Thorne stared, his mouth slightly agape. He had tried to frame her as a piece of property, and she had just displayed a competence and courage that made his blustering look foolish. Without another word, he grunted and stepped aside, his face flushed with anger. Caleb looked at Lynn, seeing her for the first time not as a bride or a victim, but as an ally. He picked up her trunk and they continued their walk, the silence behind them now one of stunned respect rather than open mockery. They left the town behind, heading toward the small speck on the horizon that was Caleb's homestead. The land grew emptier, the silence deeper. The cabin, when they reached it, was little more than a one-room box of rough-hewn timber under a vast, unforgiving sky. A corral held a single horse, and a half-dug well stood as a monument to his solitary struggle. Lynn surveyed the scene. The barren dirt, the stark cabin, the immense loneliness of the place. Caleb watched her, waiting for the disappointment, for the tears. This was not the promised land. It was a place of back-breaking work and uncertain reward. She turned to him, her gaze clear and direct. "The well is not deep enough," she said. "The soil is dry, but the creek bed has darker earth. The water is closer there." It was not a complaint. It was an assessment, and it was correct. Caleb had been digging in the wrong place for 2 months. She had been here for less than an hour and had already seen the solution. He did not yet know that the secret she carried was far heavier than the small trunk in his hand. That night the cabin felt both too small and too large. A single room with a bed in one corner, a table with 2 chairs, and a cold stove. Caleb had given her the bed, taking a blanket to the floor near the hearth. The silence between them was thick with unspoken questions. He had bought her a meal at the small eatery in town, where they had eaten without speaking, acutely aware of the curious eyes on them. Now, alone, the pretense of being anything other than 2 complete strangers bound by a contract was impossible to maintain. He finally broke the quiet, his voice rough. "You handled those horses well." She was sitting on the edge of the bed, her hands folded in her lap. "My father delivered goods for the merchants in the city. I grew up with horses." "The letters didn't mention that." "The letters were written by the man who arranged our marriage," she replied, her tone flat. "He wrote what he believed you wanted to read, that I was obedient, that I could cook and sew." "Can you?" he asked, not as a challenge, but out of genuine curiosity. A small, wry smile touched her lips for the first time. It changed her entire face, softening the severe lines of her composure. "I can sew. My cooking is adequate, but I am better at making things grow." There was another long pause. Caleb sat up, leaning his back against the cool stone of the fireplace. "Why did you agree to this, Lynn? To come all this way to a place like this, to a man you've never met?" She looked down at her hands, and when she looked up again, the brief warmth of her smile was gone, replaced by a deep, weary sorrow. "In San Francisco, my family owes a great debt to a powerful man, Mr. Chin. My father is not a good businessman. He made promises he could not keep." She took a slow breath. "Mr. Chin is a man who collects on his debts. He has other businesses that swallow young women and are not kind to them." Caleb understood immediately. It was a story as old as the frontier, a tale of debt and desperation. "Mr. Chin also arranges marriages for men like you," she continued. "Men in remote places who need a wife. He offered to cancel my father's debt in exchange for me. My family would be safe. They would be free." "So he sold you," Caleb said, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "No," she said, and her voice held a sudden, surprising firmness. "I chose. It was my decision. This was the only path that saved them. The man who wrote the letters, he described me to Mr. Chin's other clients as plain, unpleasant, the ugly daughter. It was to ensure no one else would make an offer. You were the only one who answered." She reached into a sleeve of her green dress and pulled out a small object. It was a piece of jade, carved into a simple butterfly, worn smooth with handling. "My mother gave this to me before I left. It is all I have of them." He saw it then, the straight spine, the steady gaze, the unflinching courage. It was not obedience, it was sacrifice. She had not been sent here. She had navigated her way here, using the only resources she had to protect the people she loved. She had allowed herself to be mislabeled and underestimated because it was strategic. The town's mockery was a price she had already calculated and willingly paid. A week later, Bartholomew Thorne made his next move. A notice was posted on the door of the territorial office, signed by Thorne, challenging the validity of Caleb's homestead claim. The argument was legal and insidious. The Homestead Act required a claimant to be the head of a family. Thorne's petition argued that Caleb's marriage to a foreign national of unproven status did not constitute a legitimate family in the eyes of the law. It was a flimsy argument, but in a territory where laws were often bent by money and prejudice, it was a dangerous one. The town buzzed with the news. It was a legal fight now, and Thorne had the best lawyers money could buy. Caleb's reputation with a gun was useless against a stack of legal papers. People who had started to show a grudging respect after the incident with the horses now pulled back, not wanting to be on the losing side of a fight with Thorne. That evening, Caleb laid out the options for Lynn as they sat at the small table. "I can put you on a train back to San Francisco," he said, his voice heavy. "If you're not here, his argument falls apart. He's coming after me, not you. You'd be safe." Lynn listened, her expression unreadable. When he was finished, she was silent for a long time, tracing the grain of the wood with her finger. "And what would happen to you?" she asked. "I'll lose the claim. Thorne will get the land and the water." "And you will have nothing," she stated. "I'll manage," he said, though they both knew it was a lie. This homestead was his last chance at a life beyond the gun. She looked at him, her dark eyes searching his face. "You stood for me at the station," she said softly. "You stood for me when that man insulted me. You did not send me back when you saw this place." She gestured around the bare cabin. "You are an honorable man, Caleb Wolf. To run would be to dishonor us both." She stood up. "Tomorrow we will go to town. We will file the marriage certificate with the circuit clerk. We will make it official in the eyes of their law. Let Mr. Thorne fight a real family." He was stunned. He was offering her an escape, a return to her own world, and she was refusing it. She was choosing to stand with him, to chain her fate to his failing homestead. He had entered into this arrangement for convenience, a practical solution to a practical problem. He had not expected loyalty. He had not expected courage. He had not expected a partner. The next day they rode into Redemption on Caleb's lone horse, Lynn sitting behind him. They walked into the territorial office together, and in front of the clerk and a handful of onlookers, they signed the marriage register. It was a simple act, a few scratches of a pen on a piece of paper, but it was a declaration of war against the most powerful man in the county. As they walked out, Caleb felt Lynn's hand slip into his. It was a small, fleeting touch, but it felt more binding than any signature on a legal document. 3 months passed. The blistering heat of summer gave way to the dry, baking heat of early autumn. The creek on Caleb's land had dwindled to a trickle, but it still flowed, a thread of life in a parched landscape. Just as Lynn had predicted, the water was closer to the surface near the creek bed. They had dug a new well there, and it ran deep and clear. Using that water, they had transformed a patch of barren ground. Lynn had worked with a relentless, focused energy that humbled Caleb. She knew the rhythms of the earth, when to plant, how much to water, how to turn the unforgiving soil into something that gave life. A sprawling garden now flourished beside the cabin, heavy with squash, beans, and tomatoes. It was an impossible splash of green in a world of brown. Their routine had become a quiet dance. He would rise before dawn to hunt or mend fences, and she would already be in the garden, her hands in the cool morning earth. They spoke little, but a language of shared work and mutual respect grew between them. He learned to read her moods in the set of her shoulders, and she seemed to understand his thoughts before he spoke them. He found himself watching her, the way the sun caught the black of her hair, the efficient grace of her movements. The word the town had used to describe her had become a foul absurdity. He saw only strength, intelligence, and a startling, quiet beauty. The town of Redemption had changed its tune. Thorne's legal challenge had been dismissed by a traveling judge who was more interested in the letter of the law than in local politics. A marriage certificate was a marriage certificate. With the drought worsening, Caleb and Lynn's thriving garden became a source of wonder, then necessity. At first, people sent their children to buy vegetables, too proud to come themselves. Then the women began to arrive, drawn by the quality of the produce. They spoke to Lynn haltingly at first, but her quiet dignity and fair prices won them over. They no longer saw the ugly Chinese daughter. They saw the woman who grew food in the desert. The final victory came on a scorching afternoon in September. A wagon pulled up to the homestead, and Caleb recognized the fine horses immediately. It was Bartholomew Thorne. He did not get out of the wagon, but sat there, his fine suit coated in a layer of dust, his face grim. His own wells had run dry. His cattle were dying. "Wolf," he called out, his voice stripped of its usual arrogance. "I need water. I'll pay." Caleb walked over to the wagon, with Lynn a few steps behind him. He looked at the man who had tried to ruin them, who had humiliated his wife. He could have refused. He could have savored the moment. He looked back at Lynn. She gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. It was her garden, her water as much as his. Her decision. "The price is 10 cents a barrel," Caleb said, his voice even. "You haul it yourself." It was a fair price, not a punitive one. Thorne stared for a moment, his face a mask of disbelief and fury. He had come expecting to be gouged or rejected. The simple fairness of the offer was a deeper blow than any insult. He finally spat on the ground. "Fine." As Thorne's men began the laborious task of filling barrels from their well, Caleb and Lynn stood together, watching. The war was over, and they had won. Not with a gun, but with perseverance, a well-placed garden, and a quiet refusal to be broken. That evening, as the sun set, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, Caleb watched Lynn watering her plants. She had replaced the green silk dress with a practical cotton blouse and skirt, and her face was smudged with dirt. She looked up and saw him watching, and a genuine, unguarded smile lit up her face. In that moment, he knew he was home. It wasn't the land or the cabin. It was her. The world had called her ugly, but he had been given the gift of seeing the truth. Love, he was learning, was not about seeing perfection in another person. It was about seeing their strength, their scars, and recognizing that they were the same as your own. And that brings us to the end of this one. If you stayed with me all the way through, thank you. Stories like this one only get told because folks like you sit down and listen. If you liked what you heard, go ahead and hit that like button. And if you want more stories from the old frontier, subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Until then, take care of yourself, and thanks again for being here.